Hey, welcome to Return to Reason. My name is David Craig. Excited to be with you guys. As a distinguished professor at Concordia University, Dr. Gad Saad has made quite a stir here in Canada simply for speaking the truth of his scientific academia, how evolutionary biology affects human behavior. He's an outspoken champion for free thinking, freedom of speech, and revealing the harms created by woke ideologies. The refreshing thing about Dr. Saad is that all of his opinions are based on the scientific method and his personal lived experience. His fourth book, The Parasitic Mind, has sold millions of copies worldwide, and his upcoming book, The Sad Truth About Happiness, is already available for pre-order. You're going to love this candid conversation about why society thinks and acts the way that it does.
Today, a special episode of Return to Reason, where knowledge and wisdom intersect.
Well, Gad, welcome to Return to Reason. I so appreciate your time for joining us. I'm excited to chat. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
Yeah, we're doing well. It's been a good day. Hey, maybe if you don't mind, let our audience know a little bit about your history, where you came out of, and how you've ended up as what some people might call a provocateur when it comes to free think.
Right. So I started my career seeking to apply evolutionary psychology, which is basically the application of evolutionary theory to the study of the most important organ that we possess, which is our minds. So, why is it that we think the way that we do? Why is it that our emotional system is built the way that it is? And so it's, as I said, applying evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology to study the human condition. And my goal, being housed in a business school, was to apply those frameworks to the study of our consumatory nature. How do hormones affect women's food behaviors? How does testosterone affect men's conspicuous consumption? And so my scientific career is really a marriage between physiology, evolutionary biology, evolutionary psychology, and psychology to study consumer behavior. So it's really quite interdisciplinary. And then for many years, all was well until I became an academic myself and started seeing these dreadful ideas proliferating from academia. And so this is why in the book, I talk about these ideas being idea pathogens. And the reason why I talk about the parasitic mind is because in the same way that an actual brainworm can parasitize the mind of a host, rendering it zombified, and therefore the host no longer behaves in its best interest, but it behaves in the best interest of the parasite that has taken over its brain. I argue that human beings can be parasitized not by only brain worms, but by idea pathogens. And so that's how I went from, if you like, being an evolutionary psychologist and a consumer psychologist to being what I call a parasitologist of the human mind, studying how dreadful ideas can render us zombies, leading us to the abyss of infinite lunacy.
Yeah. Hey, question on, just as you're talking about idea pathogens, why as humans do you think that we are subject to, or groupthink seems to be something that can easily bring in a lot of people? Why are we so subject to that? And how can we combat it as a second question?
Sure. So I'll start with the first part. Why are we susceptible to groupthink? Look, we're a social species, right? Had we been a solitary species, as is the case for countless other species, then what others think of me and how I fit within some social system would be unimportant to me. So, for example, in the context of consumer behavior, keeping up with the Joneses is actually a mechanism that drives much of the economy, right? Envy. Why do those next to me have the Porsche and I don't? Let me work harder. Let me go on debt so that I can also signal that I'm successful. So your first question, why are we susceptible to be parasitized by bad ideas? Now, that is one that I really drill down, in the parasitic mind. And I think there are different reasons depending on which idea pathogen we're talking about. And I argue in the book that the one thing that is common across these idea pathogens is that it frees us from the pesky shackles of reality, right? They're liberating, right? So, for example, social constructivism is liberating because it argues that your child could truly be anything if only they were given the right socialization. Your child could be the next Lionel Messi, could be the next Michael Jordan, could be the next Albert Einstein. Well, that's a very hopeful message to me as a parent, but it's perfectly rooted in nonsense, because Lionel Messi did not start off life with an equal likelihood of being the great soccer player that he is as someone who would end up being 6'10" and cumbersome. And so a lot of these idea pathogens, if you like, navigate in the currency of endless hope, but they're perfectly false premises.
More of this conversation in a few minutes.
Hey, just to back up a little bit, we talked about the idea pathogen of postmodernism, which certainly both of us being in Canada, we see it in a lot of, I won't say names, but different leaders in our country that seem to be driven by the idea of, in postmodernism, it has a lot of things that fall under its purview. When, also as well, you mentioned the war on reason. In your career, when did you first start noticing the war on reason was starting to move mainstream and really was having an effect on mass people, I should say?
So there are different. So, for example, the first time that I was exposed to some postmodernist gibberish was in a first or second year doctoral course when I was a PhD student. But really, when I saw it not only manifesting itself in academia and then, as you said, permeating to the greater society, is actually when I first saw it in my scientific career. Because it turns out, David, that most people believe that biology could be applied in explaining the behavior of every species on Earth except one, called humans. So somehow biology and evolutionary theory can explain the behavior of your dog, of the mosquito, of zebra, of elephants, of tigers, of dolphins. But don't you dare say that biology explains human behavior. And certainly, if you're going to use evolution to explain something about the human condition, that's fine. It might explain why evolution created opposable thumbs. We've evolved opposable thumbs, but it certainly can't explain anything above the neck. So evolution stops at the neck. Don't you dare say that explains the human mind. And of course, that results in all sorts of other idea pathogens. So, for example, radical feminism says that there are no differences, no biological-based differences between men and women. Everything is due to social construction. So even the most fundamental biological differences between men and women is rejected. So I first was having that fight on reason, against reason, in my scientific career, because when I would submit a paper to a journal, prestigious journal, that wasn't open to biological ideas, it would get desk rejected, meaning it wouldn't even go out for review, because the editor would write back to me and sort of, I'm paraphrasing what they're saying, but they would say, what does biology have to do with behavioral sciences? What does biology have to do with consumer behavior? What do you mean? Biology has everything to do with consumer behavior. I mean, your hormones don't suddenly stop being important when you are putting on your hat of a consumer, right? And so I first saw it in my scientific career, but then I saw it permeate everywhere, right? Because, hashtag the future is female. There is nothing that a man can do that a woman can't do, and, all that stuff. Now, of course, I'm a strong supporter of equity feminism. Equity feminism simply says men and women should be treated equally under the law. And I think most of your viewers, reasonable people, would say, yeah, of course they should be treated equal under the law. But the fact that equity feminism holds doesn't mean that men and women are indistinguishable from each other. We can both be different while equal under the law. And so while I first saw this insanity in the battle in my scientific career, I quickly saw that, Houston, we have a problem. These kooky ideas might start off in some esoteric department in the humanities or in the social sciences, but bad ideas break out of the lab, just like actual viruses break out of a lab. Stupidity also breaks out of academia, and eventually it infects everything.
You mentioned that even some of the scientific journals you were writing getting rejected early would be a form, in a sense, of early cancel culture, before maybe the term was dubbed cancel culture. How has these ideas gone into academia for the negative? Why are we on that path, and how is that affecting basically academia?
Well, yes. I mean, in endless number of ways, it's negatively affecting academia, and hence, forgive me not to plug again, but that's the whole point of why I wrote
Yeah.
The Parasitic Mind. Look, let's do a few of them. When you have thought policing, the biggest danger is not necessarily the government coming after you and stopping you from saying something or being canceled on social media. The most pervasive danger is when you create an ethos whereby people are no longer confident to speak and therefore they self-censor. So the
Yeah.
greatest damage in the context of an academic environment where ideas should be flourishing back and forth, we should be debating, we should be engaged in a, in the Talmudic tradition, you always fight back and forth, right? The
Yeah.
Socratic method, right? So the second that professors say things like, I am terrified of my students because I'm afraid of saying a single word that might be
Yeah.
misconstrued and therefore I might get canceled, that's bad for the purity of the educational process.
Return to Reason conversations continue after this.
Let's take another example. The ethos of diversity, inclusion, and equity, which,
Yep.
of course, in the book, I organized the acronym to be the DIE cult,
Yeah.
because that's where meritocracy goes to die. Diversity,
Totally.
inclusion, and equity has no place, well, in any meritocracy. Of course, there should be no institutional barriers for any individuals from flourishing. But in many cases, we're fighting a phantom thing, right? For example, should we be better allies to women in universities today? Well, 70 years ago, we should have been, because women couldn't go to medical school and couldn't go to law school, and few were entering PhD programs, and none were in veterinary schools. Fast forward to today, there are more women than men in every conceivable field that you can think of. So there was a problem that we faced in the past. We've redressed it correctly,
Yeah.
and we no longer face it. So the phantom that we are fighting via diversity, inclusion, and equity, not only is it non-existent, that phantom, but it is contrary to the most fundamental tenet of science, which is your identity is irrelevant. There is no indigenous pure mathematics. There's just pure mathematics. There is no transgender neuroscience. There's just neuroscience. What the scientific method does is it liberates us from the shackles of our personal identities, right?
Yeah.
I'm Lebanese Jewish, but I don't do evolutionary psychology as a heterosexual Lebanese Jew who was a former war refugee. I just do evolutionary psychology. So now you might say, okay, well, I get that, but what are the actual negative consequences of, adhering to DIE? Well, here's one. Everything now is adjudicated through the DIE prism. If you're going to get a professorship or not, you better meet certain immutable characteristics. Are you transgender? Are you a person of color? Right? It's no longer about what my CV looks like. How about this? When I apply for a scientific grant because I want to do some research, the first thing that is cared about is not whether I'm going to cure diabetes or solve a 300-year-old math problem that nobody's able to solve. First, I have to do a diversity, inclusion, and equity statement, which basically says, if I were to win this grant, how will I implement diversity, inclusion, and equity at every step of my research program, in my methodology, in my theoretical development, in the hiring of people in my lab. Imagine what Martin Luther King, who I think his birthday was yesterday, what he would say about this, right? The I Have a Dream speech was about, I have a dream that my daughter would be judged on the strength of her character, blah, 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 not on the color of her skin. Well, now under the cloak of progressivism, we're implementing everything that is contrary to what Martin Luther King said. So everything is being affected in academia by this nonsense.
Hey, Gad, in just a moment, I do want to talk about your new book, The Sad Truth About Happiness. And I urge everyone listening, pre-order it. I actually pre-ordered it last night. I'm excited to read it. I do want to get to that in a moment, but you just hit on something I wanted to chat about, identity politics. And what is our obsession? And why do you see large companies, sports institutions that are actually starting to walk down this business of wokeness, identity politics, making the general population happy, so to speak? What's your thought?
Yeah, well, it's again, it's one of the something that I discussed quite extensively in the parasitic mind. It's because they are conflating, equality of outcomes with equality of opportunities, right?
Yeah.
So, uh, if there are more people of one race in prison than another race, there are more Black people in American prisons than there are Vietnamese people. Aha, that must be due to racism,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Uh, if if there aren't enough professional hockey players in the NHL who are indigenous or who are Black, aha, that's racism. So the level of imbecility, the level
Yeah.
of stupidity is so outlandishly shocking. That's precisely why I use the metaphor of the parasite, because nothing else could explain the hijacking of human reason so perfectly. So
Yeah.
that's the reason why the NHL and all the rest of them are simply unable to understand that you're not going to have equal demographic representation in every single sphere. Look,
Yeah.
Nobel Prizes, almost 25% of Nobel Prizes have been won by Jews. Jews are 14 million people in the world. So the extent to which Jews are overrepresented in the Nobel Prizes is astonishing.
Yeah.
Well, maybe there is something in the culture of Jews that makes them be academically excellent and what makes other cultures not succeed as well
Yeah.
academically. But no, it must be because it's a Jewish plot. It must be because
Yeah.
there is a hatred against indigenous people winning the Nobel Prize. It's insane.
More of this conversation in a few minutes.
Hey, tell us a bit about your book, The Sad Truth About Happiness. Happiness is a pursuit of everybody. Everyone wants to be happy. If you think about it, what does people want? They work to be happy. They have family to be happy. Tell us a bit about your book. Why'd you write it?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. Actually, in the first chapter of that book, I answer that question, but I'll give you a summary. So the parasitic mind, if you like, is the flip side of the coin of the
Sure.
mind, right? It's the negative mindsets that we adopt that
Yeah.
cause us to kind of be led to the abyss of infinite lunacy. But wouldn't it be nice to once in a while write about the opposite thing, right? So, for
For
example,
sure.
in psychology, we talk about negative psychology. Why do people suffer from mental health disorders? But then positive psychology is about happiness, contentment, well-being. So that's sort of, if you like, the academic answer. But on a more personal level, anybody who knows me, whether it be personally or through my social media and media engagements, knows that I'm a very affable person. I'm almost always smiling, knock on wood. I
Yeah.
always seem to be jovial. And so I would often get emails from people where they say, how is it that you're able to take on all of these things and yet you always are playful and you're joking, and even though you have a very serious career? And so I would once in a while offer some advice on social media, which to me seemed like it's a blatantly obvious piece of advice. But then I would hear back from many, many people who said, oh my God, you don't know how much that piece of advice influenced me. And so I kind of had this little aha moment where I thought, I never thought of being sort of a self-help person. But then I thought, well, wait a minute, I've got this huge platform.
Yeah.
I think I've got something to say about happiness. By the way, part of happiness we can't control. About 50% of happiness differences across people comes from just genetic disposition. Some of us
Okay.
have a sunny disposition, others have a less rosy disposition. But that still leaves 50% to be up for grabs, that you can actually implement things to hopefully lead a better life.
Yeah.
And so I thought, you know what? I'd like to take a shot at writing a book that is partly personal anecdotes and partly, rooted in the science that I'm familiar with. Also bringing in ancient wisdoms, ancient Greek wisdoms, for example. The ancient Greeks wrote tons about how to live the good life, and many
Yeah.
other cultures as well. And so I thought, I'm very, if I may say, I'm quite adept at weaving personal stories with science. That's one of the reasons, by the way, why I think the parasitic mind did so well, because
Yeah.
while it contains tons of, very rigorous scientific and philosophical concept, but it's also interwoven with a lot of the Gadisms, the personal
Yeah. Yeah.
stories and so on. And so I thought, you know what, it'd be really fun to write such a book. David, I'm not someone who's a one-trick pony type of guy, and that, you know what, it could have been very easy for me to milk it. Let me write The Parasitic Mind, the sequel, part 2, and I'm sure it would do very well. But I'm someone who, and I actually talk about this in the next book, I'm someone who really lives to some extent to the ethos of, variety is the spice of life, including intellectual variety seeking. I like to explore many different intellectual landscapes. And so while I could have written, book 2 and book 3 along The Parasitic Mind, I like to dabble in all sorts of territories. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to take a shot at writing a happiness book. Let's see how it goes.
That's awesome. Well, I'm excited to read it, Gad. It reminds me of, even for myself personally, I try to practice the art of gratitude, because you have different things that might try to steal and take away your happiness depending on situations. But I find if I can get back to think, what am I thankful for? My wife, my family, my kids. It really helps stem that way. But hey, for our audience who's watching and watching this part, how can they support you? How can they connect with you? Let them know how they can know what Gad Saad is up to.
Thank you so much. So please, number one, go to Amazon and pre-order The Saad Truth, S-A-A-D, Truth About Happiness. Yes. It really is important, because once the book is released, all of the pre-orders are instantiated, and then you can quickly get on the bestseller list, and then that creates a domino effect. So if you support my work, please pre-order it, number one. Number two, I host a YouTube channel and a podcast called The Saad Truth, S-A-A-D, where, not unlike what we're doing here, I invite people for chats. I've been doing this for almost a decade now. You can go and subscribe to my podcast and YouTube channel, and then I'm everywhere on social media. You can follow me there.
Awesome. Thank you, Gad. Well, the 2 books as well, the sad truth about happiness, looking forward to reading that. The Parasitic Mind seems to be the gift that keeps on giving as well, which is great. Thank you so much for your time, Gad. Really appreciate it. We're looking forward to doing this again.
Thank you so much for having me. That was a fun chat. Cheers.
You are an essential part of this series. Support truth, knowledge, and wisdom by sharing this show with a friend. Visit returntoreason.tv. There, you can subscribe to our newsletter by clicking Become an Insider. Get the latest articles, episodes, and exclusive content. It's Return to Reason.